Tom worked with the Peace Corps as a deputy director of the Latin American Division. And he served as Associate Dean for Administration at the Stanford Law School. He served as Governor's appointee on the California Commission on Mental Health. Tom came to Westport in 1996 as a retiree and joined the Wise Men. But his retirement didn't last very long, as he went to work for Save the Children as a special assistant to the president. He's made an 18-country review of their field offices, developing findings and recommendations, and is monitoring corrective actions. That doesn't leave him too much time to come to Wise Men's meetings. But today, Tom will speak of the 4 years he spent as a Watergate Associate Special Prosecutor, working under Archibald Cox and Leon Jaworski. Please welcome Tom McBride.
Good morning, fellow Wise Men, and particularly fellow Hoot Owls. That's an important part of my bio. I sing tenor with the Hoot Owls. And at yesterday's presentation, I gathered, Stu, that they didn't have a single tenor there. My thoughts were with you.
My thoughts were with you, too.
Yeah, I don't want to know what they were. I obviously have had some trouble holding a job, as you'll know from Hank's introduction. I came to Westport and I retired and I couldn't even hold that job because my wife made me go back to work. And so I feel a little regretful about not being steady at the Wise Men's meetings, but I'm usually in Bolivia or Mali or some other place on Thursdays, so haven't been able to get here much. The Hoot Owls is the one extracurricular activity to which I try to devote myself when I am here. And I'll tell you, the esprit among that group and the pleasure we bring both to ourselves and to those for whom we sing is very, very rewarding. I hope, Stu, to be back with you on a more full-time basis very soon.
Amen.
Amen. Now, when you raise your hands and ask questions, if I don't recognize you, that's because I have practically no eyesight. Warren Russell is my chauffeur, who brings me to Hoot Owls and who brought me here this morning because they won't let me drive anymore. But in spite of all that, I do want you all to know I can still read the New York Times, and I read this morning that Ken Starr came out against the Special Counsel Act, yes, which I thought was one of the most astonishing pieces of news of the year. So the worm has turned, if you excuse the expression. I don't know if you... Yeah. Well, it's nice to talk to a crowd this age. I'll tell you, I speak to college kids and high school kids and start to talk to them about Watergate, and they don't know who Haldeman was and who Ehrlichman was and who John Mitchell was. And at least with this crowd, you were all there, papers and the TV pretty avidly, almost all of you, so I don't have to go through the facts of Watergate. I can kind of get to some of the larger issues right away. If there's things that are cloudy, you can ask questions at the end. I just want to, I guess, to refresh your memory a little with some of the great lines from Watergate. You remember Mitchell at the beginning of the cover-up, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And let's see, Ehrlichman, when Pat Gray, our fellow Connecticutian, was up for FBI director confirmation hearings, and it looked like they weren't going to confirm him, and he was destroying evidence for Watergate. And the question was, should we withdraw the nomination? And Ehrlichman said to the president, I think we should let him hang, twisting slowly, slowly in the wind. These guys could write a Shakespeare play, I tell you. They were something else. They were something else. And then that famous one, follow the money. Anybody know who that was? Deep Throat. That was his words to Woodward. Follow the money. And then, of course, I am not a crook. Remember that one? And then I think more seriously and momentously, the famous March 21st, 73 conversation with John Dean and the President, in which Dean said, "Mr. President, there is a cancer on the presidency." That was the most damning and damaging conversation until the very end, until days before Nixon's resignation, when the so-called smoking gun conversation came out. One of the things that I think is most interesting is that we now know a lot more. In 1977, Congress passed the Presidential Records Preservation Act, which meant that the tapes and other White House documents became the property of the U.S. government and went into the National Archives. They, after over 20 years of argument and litigation, have finally released 3,700 hours of Nixon tapes. 200 of those hours have been published, and those are the excerpts principally relating to Watergate. And I read through those recently, and they answer some of the unanswered questions, not all of them. They certainly add a lot to the record, and I'm going to quote from a lot of those as I talk to you this morning to try to amplify what we, as Howard Baker said, what did he know and when did he know it? The tapes that we do have, that we had, resulted from that famous Supreme Court opinion, U.S. v. Nixon. And I was in court that day that it was argued. Leon Jaworski was then the special prosecutor, Archie having been fired. This is my Archie tie, by the way. My wife told me I had to wear Archie Cox tie. And Jaworski said this: "Now, the President may be right in how he reads the Constitution, but he also may be wrong. And if he is wrong, who is there to tell him so?" And that was indeed the crux of the case. And the Supreme Court decided it is for this court to tell him so, and ruled 9-0 that he had to surrender the tapes. Nixon was at San Clemente the day that decision was handed in with Alexander Haig. And Haig has described more off the record the tantrum which Nixon threw when he heard of that opinion, and particularly the perfidy of Warren Burger, his law and order Nixonian appointee to the court, who wrote the opinion for the 9-0 decision. He raged at that act of treachery. Just to set the stage a little and to show you the relatively small supporting role I played in this large cast of characters, there were basically 3 or 4 different activities going on. First off, we had the U.S. Attorney's investigation. That started right after the burglary, the day after the burglary. FBI and the U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia investigating the burglary and the higher-ups, if possible. That was succeeded by the appointment of the special prosecutor in May of 1973, initially Archie Cox. I joined Archie 2 days after he was appointed. He brought with him from Harvard Jim Borenberg, later Dean of Harvard Law School. Jim called me and asked me if I'd come over just to help him get started. I came over and ended up staying, as so often happens with those jobs. Then we also had the Senate Watergate Committee, which actually started about April of 1973. And you're all familiar certainly with Sam Urban and the other members of that committee, including our own Lowell Leiker. I'll tell you a little story about that committee. I prosecuted Gulf Oil Company for making illegal campaign contributions. Their Washington money man, bag man, if you will, was a guy named Claude Wild, who was the vice president of Gulf Oil. Claude was a Washington fixture. He was always ready with a little cash for a congressional race or a Senate campaign. he testified to us how much pressure had been put on him to contribute big bucks. I think they gave $100,000 or $200,000 to the Nixon campaign in cash, unreported, before the effective date of the new campaign finance law. And he then went up to the Senate committee to testify. And the senators piously said, "Mr. Weil, did you feel strong pressure from John Mitchell when he talked to you?" "Oh, yes, yes, I did." "What did you think you'd be cut off from access to the White House?" "Well, it was almost extortion, wasn't it?" Well, they went on like that. He came back to my office, and his lawyer told me, he said, "You know, Claude has been through this city for 25 years, through thick and thin. He's seen a lot of seamy stuff." He said, "He told me today takes the cake." He said, "Of the 7 members on that committee who were grilling me, I'd given cash to 6 of them." The only one he hadn't given cash to was Irvin, which is interesting. And the other members, I'll tell you who they were. It was Howard Baker, Lowell Weicker, Montoya, Inouye, Talmadge. That was it. Was that 7? I think that's it. You know, except for, well, I won't say more about the committee. Anyway, so we had the Senate committee, and then beginning in early 1974, of course, we had the House Judiciary Committee on Impeachment. So we had these 4 entities. And I should make clear that the Watergate Prosecutor's Office really, we lived almost hermetically sealed. We did not talk except in the most formal context within these other entities. We did not want to taint our evidence. We did not want to be accused of undercover or unknown secret behind-the-scenes dealings. We wanted to keep a total image of fairness. You know, most importantly, as I say, we wanted to ensure the success of our criminal prosecutions. Archie even went up to the Senate committee and asked them not to hold their hearings because he felt the publicity would prejudice any possibilities of fair trial. Of course, they refused. But that was the lengths to which we went to protect the integrity of the prosecutive process. And we felt it was above all, ultimately, to bring these people to the bar of criminal justice, leaving aside, of course, the impeachment committee and the president, and not get these waste our time in sideshows, which would allow for no ultimate accountability. Now, in the Watergate Prosecutor's Office, we had 5 task forces. We had the Watergate Break-In and Cover-Up, which was, of course, the one on which the spotlight centered. We had ITT. We had the Plumbers. That was that secret group in the White House that was doing all the looking for leaks. That's why they're called the Plumbers. We had the dirty, I think that included, and then we had Dirty Tricks. That was Donald Segretti and all this campaign dirty trick stuff. And then we had campaign contributions, and that's the one I headed. We had a total of 38 lawyers in the office, plus some support staff. I had 10 lawyers working for me. I had the largest task force because we had the most cases, but they were certainly not the most notorious cases. We prosecuted over 30 major corporations and, more importantly, corporate chairmen and presidents for illegal campaign contributions. Among the and some fundraisers, most notably Maurice Stans, Herb Kalmbach, who was, to quote, the president's personal attorney, and among the more notable corporate officials was George Steinbrenner and Armand Hammer. They were 2 out of the 30, I think maybe the only 2, whose behavior was so egregious that they were forced to ultimately plead and be convicted of felonies as opposed to misdemeanors. Obstruction of justice, subornation of perjury, and so forth. I will tell you now in full public view, and you can tell him if you see him, Armand Hammer's dead, you probably won't see him too soon, I hope. Or Steinbrenner, who's still around, as we well know, that their behavior was right at the top of the scale in terms of sleaziness. Particularly Steinbrenner, who was willing to use employees of his American shipbuilding company prompt them and support them in going before the grand jury and lying, exposing themselves to prosecution for serious, serious crimes, taking the fall for him. And it was only with the courageous intervention of Judge Sirica that we were able to get independent lawyers for them and convince them that he was just leading them on a path to jail to save his own hide. So ultimately, anyway, he pleaded guilty to felonies. Did not serve a day in jail. He got a friendly judge in Cleveland, which was his hometown, but was fined substantially and did end up suspended from baseball for a while. Behind the scenes of the Watergate Prosecutor's office, we had some tense moments. It sounded like it was all sweetness and light, at least up until the Saturday Night Massacre. But we as prosecutors often had a tension with Archie. Archie was very dedicated to constitutional, institutional concepts of separation of power, executive privilege, and so forth, and very, very cautious in following the trail to the president. We tended to be a little more gung-ho prosecutors, you know. He was just another defendant, or potential defendant, as far as we were concerned. But Archie was a great break and restraint, and in retrospect, wiser than we, because he kept us at a plane of behavior that ensured that the public had trust in our fairness. And that's really all we had going for us. The White House was just waiting for us to make a misstep. They accused us in any event of running a political vendetta, of being partisan, etc., etc., but they never could produce any evidence that we were, and in fact we weren't. We had a big fight over Kleindienst. This was with Jaworski. The task force wanted to make him take a felony plea because he lied before the Congress about dropping the antitrust suit against ITT. Archie decided, well, Leon decided, but after consulting on the phone with Archie, that the misdemeanor plea was appropriate. The whole ITT task force quit and walked out. They felt that strongly. Jaworski himself came into the scene into a hostile atmosphere. We viewed him as a wheeler-dealer, political operative, Lyndon Johnson lackey from Texas, who would sell us out in a minute. We were dead wrong. He was tougher than Archie, and in some ways more skillful. He was a real politician, and he didn't give an inch. And I remember the day when he first heard the president on tape. This was about December of '73. He was disgusted, just totally appalled, and also convinced of the president's guilt. And from then on, he pressed very, 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 very hard to a successful conclusion. Well, I won't go into the Kalmbach plea. That was another one that was a big argument in the office. Also, the Maurice Stans plea. Those are the ones in which I was heavily involved. The one thing about the Kalmbach plea, I will tell you, I had Kalmbach. He was a lawyer from California. He was called the president's personal attorney. I think maybe he'd done tax returns for him a couple times. But he was basically a fundraiser of really big bucks. And he would go around the world shaking down ambassadors or anybody else. You know, he didn't talk to anybody for less than $100,000. Very suave guy, very smooth guy, but essentially a pretty dumb guy. And we finally decided to let him plead. He had to plead to several felonies, but we let him plead to the campaign contributions felonies and not the cover-up. He was involved briefly in the cover-up at the beginning. And he went to John Ehrlichman and he said, John, we've been friends all our lives. Barbara, my wife, and your wife, Joan, are friends. Now tell me, is this all on the up and up? And Ehrlichman said, yes, you go ahead and raise that money. And so he's raising money, and they're slipping it into, you know, envelopes in people's mailboxes and so forth. And Tony Ulasewicz, I don't even remember him, that funny New York cop that was the bag man for them. He said to Kalmbach, you know, this isn't kosher. And Kalmbach says, what does kosher mean? I mean, that's the kind of guy he was. So we finally took his plea. Leon in his book writes this paragraph why we took the plea. You know, he was a lackey. He didn't have, I think he said he didn't have adequate mental supervision. He was a follower, not a leader, and all this stuff. And Leon Kalmbach called me. This is long after I'd left Watergate and he was back in California. And he said, "Did you see what Leon said about me in his book?" And I said, "Yeah, gee, that must be painful. That really hurts." And he said, "Yeah, no." And he went on, crying on my shoulder. We were pretty good friends by then. And I hung up. I never had the nerve to tell him that I wrote what Leon So anyway. Well, there are some other funny moments. The burglars themselves, they were clearly the gang that couldn't shoot straight. One of the little-known stories is that before the break-in was the second time they'd been in, which is because they screwed it up the first time. They didn't put the bugs in the right place or on the right phones. Second, they went in the second time, and then they left tape out on the lock, and the security guard came by, saw the tape, took it off. They went down and retaped it. Not too smart. But before that, they had a real device for getting in Watergate. They hired a banquet room in the Watergate Hotel, and they got easels and flip charts, and they had a sales presentation for land development in Arizona with just them attending, like they were developers or something. They had this whole presentation, and the idea was they'd stay there, they'd lock up the place, they'd then be in the building, and they could go up to Watergate. Well, of course, what happened is they got locked in the banquet room all night. These guys were something. You know, Liddy, they broke into Fielding's office, the Ellsberg psychiatrist out in California. First off, they had one of the Cuban guys who was a locksmith. You know what the locksmith tool they used? A sledgehammer. That's how they got in. Then they took a picture of Liddy in the parking lot with Dr. Fielding's parking place sign beside it. Then they found the picture in Hunt's safe at the White House after the Watergate burglary. I mean, these guys were something else. As Nixon says in one of the tapes, he says, "Now this Liddy, he's a little nutty, isn't he?" He had it. Well, so anyway, and then the whole thing really began to fall apart with McCord. He was, of course, one of the original burglars. He was on site in the Watergate suite while Hunt and Liddy were outside. He's the guy who turned off his walkie-talkie to save the batteries, so they couldn't tell him when the cops came. Dan, what? Ehrlichman, in one of these new tapes, Ehrlichman says, "You know, we have a knack for doing things ineptly." He says, "If we can't do them aptly, I don't think we should do them." So anyway, other big moments were, of course, when Butterfield revealed the existence of the tapes. That was a bombshell. For me, a big moment was the, quote, Rosemary Woods list. You may not remember what that was or heard of it. We couldn't figure out who had given all this cash early on because they didn't have to report it. The law did not require it, and they burned all the records. And we found, actually through the Common Cause lawsuit, we turned up a list that Rosemary Woods had. And it was like my defendant's list. Almost every person we prosecuted as a donor was on that list. You know, it would say, employees of American Airlines, $100,000. And you go and you find out they took $100,000 out of the ticket sales or whatever and gave it. That's illegal. It had all this. That's how we found Steinbrenner. It said employees of American Shipbuilding. And it listed about 20 employees who gave $5,000 each. The FBI went on an interview and the guy's annual salary was $14,000. We told the FBI, at Steinbrenner's urging, "I'm such a strong supporter of Nixon that I, you know, out of $14,000 a year you gave $5,000? Well, I don't know. What's the time? I want to leave plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, you're doing fine.
Okay.
Keep rolling.
Okay, I forgot to start when I started, and I want to be sure I leave plenty of time for questions. I know how cantankerous you guys are. So. Well, back in the spring of '74, things were not looking good for Nixon, but it was still kind of touch and go. the House impeachment inquiry was going on, we had two tapes which were pretty damning. One was September 15, 72, in which he congratulates Dean for keeping the leaks in the dike plugged, for putting his fingers in the dike. And that was the day the burglars were indicted. This is before the 72 election. And there's a great sigh of relief. They've only indicted the burglars. We can cut it off at the pass. We can stop it at that. You know, we'll pay them off, give them clemency if necessary, and the thing will go away. And the country doesn't give a shit about it. Ziegler said it's a third-rate burglary. And Nixon, in one of the later tapes, recent tapes, says, burglarizing the Democratic National Committee is no blot on a man's record. So, we had that September 15th tape. Then we had the March 21st Cancer on the Presidency tape. And that's the one where Dean lays out the whole thing. Now, Nixon knew most of it already, unbeknownst to Dean. But Dean laid out the whole thing. He said, you know, this is endless. This could cost $1 million. And Nixon says, we could get it. I guess we have to, or some words to that effect. I'm not quoting verbatim. Dean leaves the room, and he had an hour conversation with the Dean. Dean leaves the room. The next person in is Rosemary Woods. He said, how much cash do we have, Rosemary? We may have a special personal need. It never has come out, but Nixon had, B.B. Rebozo had some cash. Of course, the committee and Haldeman had a lot of cash. But Rosemary had a little cash that the president had given her. I found one, only I don't know what was in there, except that we know one contribution for $100,000, which was given by the Wallaces, who owned the Reader's Digest. They had given it to Nixon and been put in Rosemary Wood's safe. I presume for his retirement, that's all I can do. And after all this Watergate stew, they ended up giving it back because they were afraid it would become known. But I don't know how many other chunks of money there were in there. Ultimately, it was a guy named Tom Pappas from Massachusetts, a Greek ship owner, multimillionaire, who came up with a lot of cash. And actually on March 7th, there's a conversation where Nixon actually thanks him for helping out with these special needs we have due to the problems of others. Well, what do we learn from all these tapes? Well, we certainly know that Nixon could cuss a blue streak. I mean, there are words in there that I wouldn't repeat even before this unmixed crowd. And I remembered vividly in the 1960 campaign that Nixon excoriated Harry Truman for using bad language in the White House. And he said, well, whenever my mother or father talks to any mother or father talks to his child, he can look at the man in the White House, and whatever he may think of his policies, he will say, well, there is the man who maintains the kind of standards personally that I would want my child to follow. And then you read on, you know, and he had his enemies list, 200 people on the enemies list, 18 organizations. He had on the enemies list the usual suspects like Jane Fonda and Ramsey Clark, Bella Abzug. The usual political opponents, Ted Kennedy. He was totally obsessed with Ted Kennedy. He had him under surveillance for 9 months with a White House paid detective, Jack Caulfield. He was on the enemies list was presidents of Yale, dean of the Harvard Law School, president of MIT, Rand Corporation, National Education Association, Philip Morris, I don't know why, and the National Cleaning Contractors, I don't know why. Joe Kraft, James Reston, Roland Evans. I mean, that list went on and on and on. His pets, however, were the New York Times was one of them. Here's what he says in 70. This is back in 71. This is after Pentagon Papers. Those sons of bitches are killing me. We're up against a conspiracy. They're using any means. We are going to use any means. Is that clear? We want somebody to be a McCarthy. Is there another Dole? I love that one. And then he's talking about Ellsberg. Try him in the press. Get it out. Leak it out. We want to destroy him. Is that clear? He'd like that. Is that clear? And then the Washington Post. They mounted actually license challenges to their TV stations. They would actually subsidize or encourage challenges to the Post license so they get them before the FCC and jerk their TV licenses. And then he says of Katharine Graham, he said, she better stop it or she's going to get her tit in a ringer. And Ben Bradley, when he heard that, he was going to publish a story, and he said, he told Bernstein, who was writing the story, he said, yeah, write it up, but leave out the tip. And then he's talking about Edward Bennett Williams, who was not only counsel to the Post, but counsel to the Democratic National Committee, which is, you know, double threat. He says of Edward Bennett Williams, who I knew quite well, and is, I think, a really nice guy, I mean, a very able trial lawyer, certainly. I wouldn't want to be in his position after this election. We're going after him. And that's, Haldeman chimes in, yeah, that's the guy we've got to ruin. And then he says, you know, he's always against Cambridge, the Eastern establishment, the Eastern elitists, the liberal press, etc. He's talking about MIT. I want those funds cut off for MIT. You get a hold of Weinberger and say, I want the goddamn funds and I want him to do it now. Get it done, okay? And it never was done. That was a lot of the ranting you'll find. He was, you know, he wanted to bomb the Brookings Institute. That's in the tapes. They didn't do it, but he and Colson would sit there and urge him on. I mean, Colson was like gasoline on the flames. And he thought, oh, here's the direst threat of all. This is the one I love. This is in the new tapes. He's talking about the Post again. And they're finished. There ain't going to be no forgetting, and there'll be goddamn little forgiving. They're off the guest list. They don't come to the Christmas party. I guess that's abuse of power. On the more serious side, he reveals himself as certainly anti-Semitic in language, if not in deed. And talks a lot about he's got a phobia about the Jews. He talks about the House Un-American Activities Committee in connection with Pentagon Papers. You know, they should open hearings. What a marvelous opportunity. You know it's going to charge up an audience. Jesus Christ, they'll be hanging from the rafters going after all these Jews. Just find one that's a Jew. You see, IRS is full of Jews, Bob. I mean, he goes on like that, on and on like that. I mean, that's why, you know, when Leon heard these tapes, he just said, that's it, we're going full bore. Another thing that comes clear from the tapes is his fundamental instinct of self-preservation. There's almost no tape where you'll find kind of honorable, loyal feelings. Only glimmers, and I'll tell you a couple instances when they do. But very early on, before they are even indicted, he asked, you know, is Liddy willing? I mean, will Liddy take the fall for everybody? And he's assured that Liddy will. And then Liddy does, well, the McCord letter, and then they get beyond Liddy, and then his next thought is that Mitchell will take the fall. Yeah. And that's where he does hesitate. And he says, I can't do that. I won't do that to him. I'd rather lose the election. And then, of course, later on, he and Ehrlichman talk, and they're then ready, clearly, to let Mitchell take the fall. And Mitchell had distanced himself by then, and he was not going to be the fall guy, and if he was going to fall, he was going to fall with Haldeman and Ehrlichman, at least, going down with it. And then finally, of course, he sacrificed Haldeman and Ehrlichman. He said on that day, he said, we've got to think the unthinkable sometimes. And even when they approached him later, they wanted pardons. He wouldn't deal with them on that. And they were all sacrificed to protect the president. He said in one tape, To admit that we approved illegal activities, the President of the United States can never admit that. Now, the irony is that he finally fell victim to his own words. He said in his 1977 book, speaking of the tapes, he said, "I gave him a sword and they stuck it in." There are a lot of questions, you know. Some I can answer, some I can't. Who was Deep Throat? What do I think about Ken Starr? Why didn't he destroy the tapes? And on and on and on. But I'm going to leave those to the question period. I do want to get to one which goes back to Baker's. What did he know and when did he know it? That was the famous question in the hearings. About the burglary. That's the big question mark. On June 20th, this is 3 days after the burglary, Nixon does ask Haldeman the details, you know, about Hunt and McCord, and he doesn't seem to know much about them. I think he did know that Hunt had done some work for the White House, and I think he knew about the Fielding burglary, but he was very, very fuzzy on the details, and you get the impression that he didn't know that they were going to break into the DNC. He says, "My God, Bob, the committee isn't worth bugging, in my opinion." Now, if you stop there, you know, that's pretty good evidence that they didn't have prior knowledge. But then he adds, "That's my public line." And then Haldeman adds, "Yeah, except for the financial thing," which I think refers to Larry O'Brien's personal financial affairs. They had him audited by the IRS, and he had received a couple $100,000 in consulting fees from Howard Hughes. And I think they were looking for that stuff, maybe, I don't know. And then in June 23rd, that's 5 days later, that's the smoking gun conversation. That's the one that triggered his resignation. It turned out it was in the 64 tapes that were the subject of the Supreme Court opinion. Came out August 2nd or 3rd, maybe it was released. And that's the one when everybody in the House read that one. They said, he's had it. Interestingly enough, that, you know, the House committee had already voted on the articles of impeachment before that tape came out. And they voted to impeach the president. There were 6 Republican holdouts, Nixon loyalists to the end. And then that last smoking gun tape came out showing that Nixon had directed Haldeman and Ehrlichman to go to the CIA, get them to intervene to thwart the FBI investigation. That was the smoking gun. The 6 then, who voted against impeachment, came running to Rodino, saying, "Hey, can we change our votes? Can we change our votes?" And Rodino said, I think that's a good quote, "The boat has left the dock." Interestingly enough, one of those 6 was our now Senate Majority Leader, Trent Lott. And then in that same conversation, Nixon says he, referring to Mitchell, was supposed to do everything he could to find out what was going on. You know what I mean? Which is some evidence that even though he may not have known specifically of the burglary or the date or the burglars, that he had given general orders to Mitchell to get the stuff on O'Brien. And O'Brien was right up there with Ted Kennedy as one, and Katharine Graham as one of his obsessive interests. And then he says, "Did Mitchell know about this thing to any much of a degree? Who was the asshole that did it? Is it Liddy? Is that the fella? He must be a little nuts. I mean, he just isn't well screwed on, is he?" Well, my conclusion is that he gave the general orders. He wanted intelligence on Larry O'Brien and the Democratic plans, Larry O'Brien's finances, the Democratic plans. He was intelligence crazy, anything you could get. And as to whether he more specifically ordered it or directed Mitchell to get into the DNC or O'Brien's office, I don't think we'll ever know. There are 3 people who would know, and they're all dead. Nixon, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman. Not Ehrlichman, Mitchell. Ehrlichman's dead too, but those are the 3 who would have had to have been in the loop. And they're not here to testify. Now on the cover-up itself, there absolutely is no question there. That smoking gun tape, and even before that, when he says, is Liddy willing? On August 1st, Haldeman says, Hunt's happy. That's after the first payment of the cover-up money. And Nixon said, yeah, at considerable cost, but it's worth it. They have to be paid. And it goes on and on and on. So he clearly knew of the cover-up. I have one final story from the new tapes. We had suspected that they were really selling ambassadorships, that Kalmbach was selling them. He was in charge of raising money from ambassadors and potential ambassadors. And he finally pleaded guilty to selling an ambassadorship. The only conviction in the annals of American criminal justice for that particular crime. And I had questioned Haldeman, questioned, of course, all the ambassadors, congressmen, and senators who supported ambassadorial appointments, Stans, who was heavily involved in a couple of them. And it was, tantalizingly close, particularly the Luxembourg one. Ruth Farkas, whose husband owned Alexander's department store and was a billionaire, had given $300,000, and his wife got appointed to Luxembourg, and she had no qualification to be ambassador to any place, Arkansas. But we couldn't get the quid pro quo. It was just a little too implicit to be able to go to a jury on those. And we probably couldn't have convicted Kalmbach had he not pled guilty. And at one point I questioned Nixon. This is a story I can't get into because it was before the grand jury. It was months later, long after he'd resigned. But I couldn't make it. It was one of the great frustrations. In getting ready for this speech, I got these new tapes out. It's published now. And I found this one. Nixon, this is June 23rd, 71. I got to tell you one thing. Ambassador to Brussels, it hasn't been promised to anybody, has it? Haldeman, no. BB says Winston Guest. He's a former ambassador to Ireland and Kennedy. He says Haldeman interrupted, Raymond Guest. He says, well, whatever, Raymond. Ambassador Raymond Guest will give $500,000. Well, anyway, I'm sure that he's talking about at least $250,000 because he gave $100,000 last time out. Now, he can be the ambassador to Brussels. Find out when John Eisenhower is leaving. That was Eisenhower's son, who was the then ambassador. His wife speaks French. My point is, anybody that wants to be an ambassador wants to pay at least $250,000. Haldeman, I think any contributor under $100,000 we shouldn't consider for any kind of thing. That's right. So just like Fred Russell, who was a big contributor, back from now on, contributors have got to be, I think, big contributors. And I don't want anything to do with political friends and all the rest of this crap where we've got to give them the good old bill. Now when he's talking to Charles Bluthorn. Who is he? Somebody might know.
Gulf and Western.
Yeah. When he goes, we want him to be bled for $250,000 too. He's got that kind of money. If I'd had that, we would have had a lot more cases, but I didn't. And Nixon achieved his just reward in any event. So it's somber. I mean, there's a lot of funny things that happened, but it was certainly a cataclysmic political event, probably the most cataclysmic political event of our generation. It eroded a lot of the respect and historic feeling that Americans have for the office of the president. It's been further eroded by our current president. I think both of those events are tragic. It'll take a long time to recover from what has happened. Now, if we have time, I'll take questions.
Before we take the questions, I want to present you with this Wiseman's desk clock
And in doing so, I want to assure you that the microphone, the hidden microphone, has been removed. The tape recorder's been removed, so it's quite safe for you to use.
Well, thank you.
His whole speech is on tape here.
Now, our procedure is to take a question and then from the front.
If you'd recognize them, because I can't see
them. And you answer. Okay, well, we'll start off with Stu.
Tom, I could listen to you for another hour, but unfortunately the wire will throw us out. I'm going to give you a softball. Who do you think was Deep Throat?
Well, I think, I'm not sure who, I think it was a ranking person in the FBI. And I think that for a couple reasons. One, Woodward had strong pre-existing contacts in the FBI at high levels. We know that from other stories he'd covered and other things he'd written. Two, I was pretty close to the FBI investigation because we worked with the agents when we were set up, and we were after June, but we were in May '73. I knew the case agents, I knew how the FBI system worked, I'd worked with them a lot before. And the kind of reports they were getting and the kind of stuff that Deep Throat was passing on to Woodward was so new and so close to what the FBI was finding, like the follow the money, that I became, I thought a lot about this. I became pretty much convinced it was somebody high up in the FBI. John Dean spent 3 months investigating the identity of Deep Throat. He concluded it was Alexander Haig. I don't agree. Yeah. I don't think Haig would ever make 3 a.m. meetings in the basement of his garage and put a flower pot on the balcony crap. Haig is certainly capable of leaking. He's a secretive guy. He's a conniving guy. But the modus operandi just didn't fit, to my view. We'll never know until Deep Throat dies and Woodward tells us, if he ever does. And of course, there's always the lurking suspicion that there was no Deep Throat.
Question in the back.
I have the easiest question. Were there any, speaking
Take it to the
of
microphone.
yeah, I have the easiest question. Were there any real clean players that you came across?
Any real
Clean.
clean?
Yep.
Well, Hugh Sloan. He was treasurer of the committee to re-elect the president. He had been instructed by Mitchell to by McBride really, to disperse the money to Liddy. And he told the truth from the beginning, despite the strongest pressures to lie. And he, of course, quit his job. Woodward went to his house about 5 days after the burglary. His wife was 8 months pregnant. It's a suburban house. It looked like something out of Pleasantville. And she says, I want you to know, Mr. Woodward, this is an honest house. So I think he was the purest. Of course, the ones on the right side, I got my heroes, Sirica among them. Everybody, a lot of the people, particularly Republicans, criticized him for putting the pressure on, long jail if you don't talk, and really putting the heat on the burglars, and it worked. McCord was the crack in the dike. And he sent that letter to Sirica and said perjury was committed here in this courtroom, and higher-ups were involved. That was the beginning of the end. All things began to crumble. Without Sirica, it could have worked.
Question.
Why did Nixon have this whole series of tapes in his offices when he knew that all these incriminating statements he would be making would be preserved and someone would get them sooner or later?
Well, he did not think anyone would ever get them. He was 100% convinced that it was impossible that anyone could ever get these tapes. He wanted them for, he quote, the historical record, which meant his version of the historical record. He wanted them also in case other people wrote books that he could come up with verbatims and demolish them. And he wanted them for a very venal reason. He had already taken, I think, a $500,000 tax deduction for his vice presidential papers, and he thought at some day in the future he could give papers and, of course, edited versions of these tapes to the National Archives and get millions of dollars in tax deductions. So he thought that they were unreachable. He also had the defenses of executive privilege, national security, lawyer-client in some instances, and it wasn't really until after the subpoenas began, well, after Butterfield revealed the existence of the taping system, and of course it ran right up till then. It was not discontinued all during Watergate until Butterfield in July of '73 revealed it. Finally, they dismantled it. And at that point, he got very conflicting advice. Pat Nixon, Nelson Rockefeller told him to destroy them. Others said, you know, you might be guilty of obstruction of justice. Maybe you'll be impeached for destroying them. He should have destroyed them. They were not under subpoena. As a lawyer, I would have said, get rid of the fuckers. But of course, he wouldn't tell anybody what was in them. Jim St. Clair never heard the tapes. How can you represent a person when they won't tell you what the evidence is? So there are all of those conflicting reasons going on. And ultimately, you know, he faced a Hobson's choice. The Supreme Court had said turn over the tapes. He could defy the Supreme Court and be impeached, or he could turn over the tapes and be impeached.
Mark.
I want to thank you very much for one of the best presentations I've heard in my 8 or 9 years as a wise man.
I appreciate that.
The historical point of view is fantastic. Okay. Leon Jaworski, when he made his prosecution, he covered the case and then presented it to the Congress, I believe, without forcing his opinion that there should be an impeachment, I believe. When Ken Starr presented his case, he went beyond that, and of course, it caused Starr's ethics advisor to resign because of that.
Sam Dash, counsel to the Senate Watergate Committee.
I wonder if you would comment on that, and also if you could also comment on Ken Starr's visit to the Congress, I think yesterday or the day before, in which he said the office of the independent counsel should be abolished.
Well, on the first point, we debated long and hard in the office. It was one of the most difficult questions. Is we had the evidence, we had all this evidence. It was all before the grand jury. There's a federal rule of requiring secrecy of grand jury proceedings. We knew we could get a court order from Sirica releasing the grand jury testimony and their supporting evidence, tapes, etc., to the House Judiciary Committee. Yet it had never been done. There was no clear mechanism. And we were very worried about stating anything which would be viewed as biased or conclusory. And Leon insisted, first off, he wanted to just transmit the evidence raw. No commentary at all. Put it in a briefcase, the transcripts and the tapes, and get Judge Sirica to look at it and say, okay, I'm going to transmit it. We find it was so, it was so complicated that he finally agreed, see, we can do a roadmap. And I wanted a statement of fact, and then reference to the supporting evidence, which would be in the same box. And that's what we did. And it all fit in one briefcase. It was a bulging briefcase, but it was one briefcase. You know, it was not a warehouse like Ken Starr. And that was given to the court by the grand jury. The grand jury voted. And that was given to the court, and Sirica examined it all, and after a week or so he transmitted it to the House Judiciary Committee. The only other contact we had with them, we did let John Doerr into our office, but we would not give him the evidence, the this is beforehand. He was counsel, by the way. John Doe was counsel of the House Impeachment Committee, a very fine, honorable lawyer. And we let him go through this stuff. We wouldn't let him take it. So he sat there for 10 nights, I think, making notes. So he knew pretty much. But it was very hard. They were playing catch-up. Heavy stakes along a strong pro-Nixon bloc in the House, opposing what they were doing. And, you know, a good lawyer and a good chairman, Peter Rodino, trying to steer a course of fairness through this political morass.
And-
On Ken's, yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
Well, on Ken Starr, on the other part of the question, the Special Prosecutor Act, I am against it. I worked in the Justice Department. I do know that the Justice Department can be independent. It's obviously, I think, a mistake for you to appoint your campaign manager as Attorney General. Both John Kennedy did it, and Robert and Richard Nixon did it, and Truman did it. Well, I'm not sure he was campaign manager, but very partisan attorney generals. But there's a very strong professionalism there. The Attorney General can always appoint a special prosecutor. Indeed, that was the mode of appointment of Cox and Jaworski. I think our safeguard is the press and the Congress. And that having an independent prosecutor law is virtually impossible to draw it in a way that really focuses on things that are truly important and where there's a genuine conflict of interest. I think the issue of conflict of interest is grossly exaggerated. I think the Justice Department, if they want to appoint special attorneys or use a special section of the Justice Department, they can do so, is well equipped generally to proceed. And in those few cases where it may not be, I think the pressure of Congress and the public can force the appointment of an ad hoc special prosecutor as Cox and Jaworski were appointed. We've had, I think, the abuses of the special prosecutor law have been awful, and they're written into the law. I have a friend, Eli Siegel, who was the subject of a 2-year-long special prosecutor investigation, spent hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and there was nothing, he didn't do anything. They let him on, I mean, it was just a clean bill of health. And that's because the triggers in the special prosecutor law are so, you know, it's hair trigger. And, well, that's my view on it. I've been against them from the beginning, and the Starr experience only has fortified my view that it's unnecessary.
Ed Van Gelder.
Tom,
Yeah.
you've not commented on the Saturday night massacre. I wonder if you could.
Well, of course, that was I'll tell you how I heard of it. I was at home with friends having dinner, raising the glass of wine to my lips, and my 10-year-old son walked into the room and said, "Daddy, you've been abolished." we were borked. Well, we knew it was coming. We knew it was coming earlier that week. The White House was putting the pressure on. They said Archie had to agree not to seek further tapes, and he had to agree by the end of that week, Friday, which was the deadline for Court of Appeals action on the Sirica decision giving us the tapes. And the implicit threat was that if he didn't, he'd be out. You know, there were 3 parties in this standoff. Richardson was fighting off the White House. Richardson and Cox were friends. The question in the final analysis on Friday was, how close a friend was Richardson? Would he, in fact, resign rather than fire Archie? And when push came to shove, he did. He proved himself to be a person of integrity. We lived through 2 weeks of uncertainty thereafter. The Monday after Saturday Night Massacre, well, of course, we couldn't help but hear the honking at the White House. Thousands of cars passing the White House. Honk if you're for impeachment. Even the police cars were honking.
We have a question in the back.
How much would it cost me to get an ambassadorship today?
I'm sure inflation has taken its toll. Now, I'm sure big donors still get ambassadorships. You know, I think Watergate, probably one of the lessons they learned is how to sell an ambassadorship without getting caught.
You?
One of the things that I've wondered about when I was reading about Nixon is he had a very close personal friend, this B.B. Rabosa. And I noticed that many times, Bibi would travel with him when normally you would think his wife would be traveling with him. I was wondering, what kind of a person was Bibi Rebozo? There was never too much news about it.
He was a Cuban refugee, self-made businessman, quite wealthy, and there was a chemistry between him and Nixon which was quite unique. They would go out on the Sequoia, the presidential yacht in the Potomac, and they'd sit there for 3 hours and not say a word sometimes. He was just a close friend. Now he took some money for Nixon. I mean, he helped him on the Key Biscayne properties. He helped him on that. He obviously held money for him because we know the Hughes money ended up in Bibi's safe deposit box, and there may have been more money. So he was a little bit of a financial helper, but I think they were just genuinely friends. He had two friends, Bibi Rebozo and Bob Abplanalp. Abplanalp was the guy who invented the valve on the spray cans. And those are his only two close personal friends. He was a guy basically without friends. And his family was very secondary. He loved his daughters, but rarely saw them or his wife. I mean, he saw them every day, but I mean rarely in the sense of being totally obsessed with politics.
Question in the back. If not, Gary, here.
Tom, thank you. Trying to wrap things up. This tape, it's probably one of the historical tapes for us. It'll probably be dubbed over many, many times. Will you be writing any articles or books that we can hope in the future? No. And the other part is, no. After the fact, did you ever talk to President Nixon or any of his associates?
I talked to Kalmbach a number of times, and that's because we developed a sort of a personal friendship or relationship at least. I think I talked to Dean a couple times. And then we had that one occasion with Nixon in the spring of '75, that would have been, where we went out to San Clemente, but that was in a formal grand jury context, and I can't talk about what we talked about.
We have time for two more questions. John?
What parallels between Nixon and Clinton do you see in the affairs, and what differences do you see, major differences on?
Well, I think this is kind of covering ground which you're well aware of. I mean, the origins of the Clinton impeachment were obviously sex. The origins of the Nixon impeachment were gross unconstitutional abuse of power. And from those two very different predicates, you build a very different structure. There's no question Clinton lied, no question Nixon lied. There's no question Nixon suborned perjury, engaged in conspiracy, engaged in bribery by offers of clemency and money. There's no question, well, there's some question about Clinton's subordination of perjury. He certainly lied to people in the hopes that they would go out and lie, but not necessarily before a grand jury. He was hoping they'd go out before the TV cameras and lie, but not knowingly. It was very different. So I never thought that the Clinton behavior amounted to an impeachable offense as I understood the Constitution, and the Nixon one did. And the Nixon one, you must remember, we're talking about really abuse of power, and it long preceded Watergate. We had the Plumbers Unit, we had the Houston Plan for Domestic Intelligence, we had wiretapping of the Kissinger aides, we had the Fielding break-in, we had all of these things, and these were long before the Watergate burglary. And I think that's what swayed the Congress most, is that here was a guy whose course of conduct and pattern of conduct was to abuse the powers of his high office by these secret, clandestine, and often illegal means, and by using the CIA, the IRS, anything else, the FCC, to punish citizens in an illegal and unconstitutional way.
Last question.
I see grave differences.
George.
Yeah, campaign financing.
No, George, into the mic, please.
Campaign financing.
is there any parallel between the situation that you prosecuted back then and what's going on right now in campaign financing?
Well, I think, yeah, there are parallels. I don't think the illegal corporate contributions are happening as much because the big corporations learned their lesson. The reason we were so successful in bagging so many is that the laws had gone unenforced for 50 years. So everybody, was living in a world where they were on paper only. So I think corporations stopped it, although they found now that they can give soft money, they can take employee contributions and so forth. I personally feel that we cannot have a full campaign contributions reform without public financing campaigns unless we amend the Constitution or the Supreme Court reverses its decision in the Buckley case. So I don't hold out a lot of hope. I read in the morning paper that Mitch McConnell is prepared to launch another filibuster to prevent Senate approval of the new campaign finance reforms proposed by Chris Shays. So, we may be in for another year of disappointment. I view that, frankly, I guess if I had to look at the national political scene domestically, campaign finance reform and health care reform, to my mind, the two transcendent issues that face us in the next 4 or 5 years.
Once more, thanks.